If you think of the top textile cities in the world, Paris would definitely be in the top 5. It is the birthplace of haute couture and the trendsetter of European fashion for centuries. So you know that there's going to be a rich opportunity for a travel tour. Today's guest, Rebecca Devaney, does just that. Weekly, she gives tours of haberdasheries, flea markets, historical sites, and many more, providing a rich, colorful, tactile experience that you're not going to find in your typical travel guide. And she has so much more to share. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Rebecca Devaney. Welcome to the show, Rebecca. Where in the world are you coming to us from?
I am joining you from Paris in France.
Now, by your accent, I don't think you're from Paris. Where are you from originally?
Well spotted. I am actually from Dublin in Ireland.
So how did you end up in Paris?
I arrived here almost 7 years ago now, and I literally kept extending my ticket home. So I came initially to study timbre embroidery at the École Lesage, the Lesage School of Embroidery.
So growing up, were you in a family of makers?
I was more in a family of literary people. I'm sort of the black sheep of the family. Everybody else worked in publishing. And then I have one side of my family who are very, very artistic. I have cousins and uncles who are furniture design, very successful furniture designers at home. And then on both sides of the family, my grandmothers, my mother, who are very interested in textiles and fashion, but more from a consumer point of view as opposed to a making point of view. So I grew up surrounded by beautiful textiles.
Nice. And beautiful words.
And beautiful words. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's come in my own textile art practice. I respond to and am inspired by poetry. So combining both of the worlds that I love.
You've got a beautiful blog. You bring in so many different angles into your blog. Is that around everywhere in Paris, those pictures and that the texture of a former period? Is that common in Paris, or is that something that you've had to find?
I think when we're in Paris, we're always inspired by the beauty that's everywhere. And that's what brings most of us there in the first place. And for me, it was the glamour and the extravagance of haute couture fashions from the 19th century. That's why I went initially. I wanted to be an embroiderer, live in an attic in a giant apartment with lots of candles and poetry and handsome men. And that's what I thought it was going to be like. The reality was a little bit different. The stories that I'm most interested in telling and exploring and discovering are oftentimes stories that have been written out of history. I'm kind of going behind the scenes, finding out about the craftspeople who worked in the studios, what it was like to work in those studios. For me, when I arrived and started doing this research, I couldn't believe that a 17-year-old French person might one day decide, I want to be a feather worker, and that's the life for me, and that in France, you can specialize in these crafts. But most of the crafts are done by women historically, because they weren't allowed to do design. So women kind of excelled in these areas. And they're the stories that have been written out of history, and they're the stories that I like telling. I like to weave women back into that kind of very rich cloth that makes up the fabric of Paris. We see the sparkling finishing piece, and it's often a man who gets all the credit. So I like to celebrate the women.
There's so many different techniques that were used in fashion of the past that in North America, we don't have access to because we're not old enough. But I see like silk flowers and featherwork, as you described. There wasn't enough history here for it to survive this recent globalization. What is the most unusual type of craft or skill that you've found so far?
For me, yes, the feather workers and the flower makers are extremely interesting. And just in the interest of being fair, there's 3 feather making studios left in Paris, and there's one in New York. There's M&S Schmalberg, and then feather workers, there's 4 in Paris, and then there's one left in one that I know of in New York, Dersch Feathers. So yes, there's a contraction of all of these skills, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 300 flower making studios in Paris. So to go from 300 to 3 in 100 years is a bit shocking. I think, like what you're saying about, historical fashion, it's that, well, in my case anyway, since COVID, when I'm out of my pajamas and out of a tracksuit, I feel so proud. But in those days, you're getting dressed meant, yes, having the flowers in your wig or your hat and the feathers. And then it meant, what gloves were you wearing? And what, your stockings were just as important as your outfit and your petticoat. And how each of those kind of accessories communicated, like your fan was so important, and communicated how wealthy you were and so on. But for me, I think, well, now that I've said fans, it's hard to choose a favorite, but fan making certainly has kind of opened up a whole new world for me of different crafts that I never considered. Glove making, something again I would never have thought of, that was a huge industry. And buttons. I find button making absolutely fascinating, that you have these tinsy tiny little treasures that contain miniature worlds of art and craft. And there's a button making factory just an hour north of Paris. Sorry, a mother of pearl button making factory, a museum an hour north of Paris. And they're just absolutely exquisite. And that has changed how I look at outfits. So I'm no longer, when I do flea market tours, and when I'm doing the flea market tours and we're looking at Chanel jackets, I'm not just pointing out the couture and the cut and the woven fabric and the ribbons. I'm also pointing out the buttons. At the moment, that's what's taken my fancy.
Well, I remember when Princess Diana came on the scene, and suddenly I started noticing it wasn't necessarily the color or the cut of the outfit, but I really enjoyed the way her clothes had texture.
Mhm.
Like there was embroidery or there was quilting or a nice button detail down the back or something like that. And I think we've just kind of grown on that. It's come back into being. Like I think for a long time embroidery on clothing was gone, where those details are coming back again.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the major change in that is that it's not us doing the embroidery on our clothes for the most part. It's outsourced, done by somebody else. So when I finished in a Lesage, I spent the next 2 years working as a contract embroiderer for Chanel and Dior and Louis Vuitton and Versace, and doing all of that kind of tiny, minuscule, meticulous work. And I was often working with very experienced embroiderers. And I remember asking a lady, whispering across the embroidery frame to a lady, because we weren't really meant to be talking, what it was like working as an embroiderer when she began her career. And she was saying in the 80s, she was working for one of the big fashion houses like Yves Saint Laurent. And they called her on a Sunday morning, and she left for work and didn't come home until the Thursday night. And I was saying, oh my God, that's amazing. And she was saying, well, think about the fashions in the 80s. They were so expressive and flamboyant and embroidered and textured and colourful. And she said, so for embroiderers, they were living the high, well, relatively speaking, they were living the high life. They had lots of work. And then she said fashions changed drastically in the 1990s into that kind of, whatever kind of heroin chic, maybe a little bit kind of androgynous dress, dark colors, very little embellishment, and they had no work. Yeah. So when I see more kind of embroidery coming in, or more interest in texture and fabric and textiles, kind of more creative clothing, it's fantastic, because it means more work for people.
Well, I see since COVID, so many people came to quilting during COVID, but I see even more people came to embroidery
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
using embroidery in very modern ways.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it's new to us to come to embroidery, but embroidery and textiles have been part of our lives forever, going back to when we had to grow our own, flax and cotton and hemp and so on. And it speaks to seasons, and it speaks to quiet evenings at home, which speaks to meditation and community. Oftentimes, you're sitting at home, you're spinning your yarn with your family members and so on, or weaving it. And I think as a society, we have lost a lot of that. And that's why creative practices like embroidery and quilting speak to so many people. It's not just because it's lovely and we create these beautiful things, it's that we're using our hands, We're relaxing, it's therapeutic, and we're expressing ourselves creatively. But yes, embroidery has boomed.
It bloomed, yes. I'm just going to take a sideways step here for a minute. You studied Mexican embroidery.
That's right. Yeah, I did indeed.
Was that your thesis?
No, my degree was an art, craft, and design degree. So I trained to be an art, craft, and design teacher in
Okay.
Ireland, and it was a joint degree. So I also qualified as a textile artist. And then after I did my degree, I went off traveling for about 2 years, and I spent a year living in Mexico. And then I went home and worked as an art teacher for 8 years. And then the year that I was due to be made permanent, I resigned to do a master's in textile art and artifact, much to my parents' horror. And my intention was after the master's to go directly to Paris, but I received a grant to go to Mexico and research hand embroidery techniques across the country. And what I wanted to do was kind of document the different aesthetic styles, the different craft techniques that I'd seen when I was living there, but also the cultural significance of embroidery to each community. And that's what was, again, this is a common thread that runs through when I was traveling around the country and interviewing the mainly women who were doing the embroidery. I would sit with them for an hour or an afternoon or 2 days or 3 days, and they would share their stories about what embroidery meant to them, their families, their communities, and their cultures. They were often very surprised that I was asking, but once they realized that I was also an embroiderer and things like that, they kind of opened up a little bit more. But they'd never been asked before. As many people who work in textiles know, you're working away in your own room upstairs, and people aren't that interested in what you're doing until you get to QUILT-Con or something like that, and everyone wants to talk forever about it. After I'd interviewed each person, I purchased a textile from them that they wanted me to purchase, effectively whatever they were most proud of. I brought them back to Ireland, where they were exhibited at the Mexican Embassy to Ireland. And what was important for me was that the portrait of the artist or the artisan was presented in front of the textile with their story, so that we created a different connection. Because I think oftentimes people see textiles as literally as an artifact or an object, and they don't understand how precious they are because they don't know that somebody's life is kind of imbued in each stitch. And that's what the stories and the portraits helped with. It was to say, oh, a person has made this and they've spent a year making it in some cases, or, 6 to 8 months making it. And that there's their memories and their emotions and their experiences in there. And that changes how we interact with textiles. That was my intention for the exhibition. And it then traveled to the United Arab Emirates, which is just a little side chapter in my life. And then it came to Paris, and it was exhibited in the Mexican embassy to France. And it was the first time they'd ever held an exhibition. So it was a fairly big deal. And, we understand it, but the embassies were all very surprised at just how much interest there is in Mexican textiles. So, or just textiles in general.
Yeah,
Uh,
museums are coming to that realization as well, that,
yeah.
oh, the textiles bring people in.
Yeah, textiles and women. Quelle
Yeah.
surprise, as they say here. So, we've all known it forever, but it's as our world is changing in a positive way. Uh,
Something fascinating about the Mexican embroideries, I listened to a couple of interviews of yours, was that, like, we have a tendency to think of Mexico as Mexico, but there was so many different groups of people, and what you found was different styles of embroidery, some even European influence, some
oh yeah.
not.
Yeah, absolutely. There's European influences, there's pre-Hispanic influences, obviously, that's the foundation of it. There's Arabic influences, there's all of these, there's Chinese, there's huge Chinese influence in Mexican embroidery. Yeah, we kind of use a catch-all term, and I don't know what we see when we say that catch-all term. I don't know if it's Frida Kahlo's blouses or kind of peasant blouses from the 1960s. But by the time I was leaving, I was able to kind of distinguish traditional costume by state and by region. And in certain places where I spent longer, I could tell which town the people were from. And it might be a 5 kilometer distance, between towns or villages, and they would have a very distinctive embroidery technique, different colors, different size motifs, different stitches, and so on. And that's because the embroidered embellishment spoke to their community, represented their community, and represented their culture. And my geography isn't great, but from one town to another in the United States, you're going to have slightly different cultures or communities and so on. And that's what the embroidery represented for them and used to, in previous times for all of us.
In quilting, there's also different flavors
Yeah.
depending on what part of the world you're from. We have Hawaiian quilting, there's Welsh quilting, American patchwork. But I was
Mhm.
also interested in finding out that there was one that's considered French quilting. And I think
Ah,
you referenced it in your last newsletter. Is it boutes or boutes?
yeah, I'll just spell it out so that there's no confusion about what I'm saying. It's spelled Boutis. And in French, it's bouti. And in English, it's booty. Um, it's not spelled that way. Booty comes across maybe as patchwork or quilting, but it's not. I'll very briefly explain the technique. It comes from the south of France, from the 17th century, when aristocrats, when they were getting married, they would send out for the bride's petticoat to be embellished with booty. And you could tell how wealthy a family was because the higher the booty went on their petticoat, the more money they could afford. And to give you a sense of this, they would be ordering these 2 years or so in advance. Like that, this is so far from Amazon click and collect.
Yes.
Uh, and you know yourself how long anything handmade takes. On the part that people didn't see, there would be quilting, like the top part of the petticoat, because quilting is faster, relatively speaking, than booty. So what booty involves, if you maybe think about Italian trapunto,
Mhm.
so you have your two layers of fabric. You have a beautifully intricate design, oftentimes with kind of foliage, flowers, the monogram of the family, because it's France, so you'd have to have that. And those lines are stitched with the tiniest of straight stitch. Okay. And then what you do is get a much thicker cotton yarn and you place the cotton yarn between the lines of stitches. So you're padding it after the fact, after it's been stitched, you're adding in the padding. And that creates this play between negative space and when the light shines through, you see the designs more clearly. I work with a lady here in Paris, Kumiko Nakayama, who's considered to be a master of bouti. It had almost disappeared in France and she's revived the craft. She invited me down to the biannual festival of bouti in the south of France, which is very exciting. And I often host workshops with Kumiko. So Kumiko teaches, and all I do is translate. I'm wearing a different hat with that one. My eyesight is not good enough for her booty. And we do a little introductory workshop, and oftentimes actually with patchworkers. And patchworkers do better than say other crafts, but it's still it's getting used to that 17th century standard of straight stitch. So, techniques that we have kind of forgotten, maybe because we feel we don't have the time anymore. But yeah, that's the French version of quilting. If Kumiko was hearing me now, she would be correcting me in French because she's thinking I'm going to say quilting. Yes.
You went to school you were going to become a teacher, but when did the research angle begin to appear in your work? Were you always interested in the history, or was that something that came later?
When I was in high school, effectively, I absolutely loved writing and I loved English and poetry and telling stories and so on. And my English teacher, who I loved, Miss Coughlin, there you go. That's like 25 years ago, very much wanted me to go to university to study English. And I didn't. I went down the art route. And I also had a wonderful history teacher, a wonderfully patient history teacher, Mr. Ryan, as well. And what both of them were all about was telling stories. For me, with research, I find research really interesting and unraveling all of these stories and so on, but it's actually the sharing of them. It's storytelling. That was kind of woven into my teaching as well for art. So when, you're teaching art, you're teaching a language. And when people understand that language, when teenagers understand that language, then they appreciate the art. Doesn't mean they have to like it. It means that they appreciate it. And it also means that they see beauty, which means that they interact with the world differently. When we're surrounded by beauty, we see things differently and we're different. That approach of sharing a language and a vocabulary and a lexicon in an accessible way where we're telling stories as opposed to big academic, inaccessible essays, it means that more people get to appreciate it. We're sharing. And that's what I'm very passionate about. I'm passionate about sharing the stories of craftspeople, particularly women, so that other people can appreciate their work and see the value in it. And I think that comes from, from when I was a teenager, I was making, little jewelry and things like that and selling it in beaded necklaces and selling them in markets. And then as my work developed, selling in craft fairs and so on. And you have that horrible moment when someone says, "That's so expensive." You kind of think, yeah, because I spent like 50 hours making it. That's all stitched by hand. And if the other person understood, they could see immediately, I don't like it, but I understand that that took 50 hours. You wouldn't have kind of those kind of heartbreaking moments. So it's, value and appreciation and sharing beauty. That's where all the research comes in, I think, for me.
You do these amazing tours of textiles in Paris. You've got all sorts of different topics. Do you do them in French and English, or do you just do them in English?
There's a point in life, Karen, where you have to say, I'm going to take the easy route. So I do the tours in English and I'm really comfortable with that. That leads into a different story that's kind of interesting. So yeah, I after I worked as an embroiderer for 2 years, like I loved working. It was all very kind of fairy tale and glamorous and so on. And I was working with these incredibly talented people and learning from them. But what they wouldn't share with me was their address book. Right. So it took me such a long time to find where's the best place for thread, where's the best place for beads and sequins and so on, because like any creative textile artist, I'm addicted to shopping. And I was finding places that I was like, there's better than this. So it took me a long time to gather my address book. Once I had, then with my background in teaching, it was never about keeping that a secret for me. It was about sharing that. So I've mapped out a route of 5 haberdasheries. So haberdasheries are notion stores, I think, in the United States, where you go to get buttons, beads, some fabrics, ribbons, needles, scissors, that kind of treasure. And I bring people on. It's a 3-hour tour on a Friday morning. And I bring people to these 5 places. And we also do, there's a yarn store for knitters. There's a needlepoint store. We get to go to Overa Soie. So Overa Soie means silkworm. And Overa Soie are a family-run business. And because it's France, they've been open for 200 years, because everything is open for 200 years or more in France. And they're in the 6th generation of their family. And they are usually only open for industry professionals, like for Chanel and Dior and people like that, or Hermes, they work with an awful lot. But as part of the textile tour, we get to go in and we meet Natalie, who's the 5th generation, and we also get to make purchases. So we can leave with bags full of silk threads for sewing or embroidery, and silk ribbons and things like that. So it's the
Things
kind
you
of tour.
didn't know you needed before you walked in.
Oh, listen, Karen, on the textile tour, the word need just goes out the window. Like you might as well forget it. The concept of need and want become very blurry. 3 kind of magical hours that I would love, because in Ireland, when I was growing up, or when I was studying, we didn't really have many haberdasheries or notion stores or fabric stores. And I used to have to make these kind of mad dash Ryanair flight, which is like a cheap low cost airline flight, across to London or Paris to buy materials. And it was always that scramble of where's the best place to go? And that's what the tours are about. They're that you can come, I know where the best place to come are, and that you're guided. You don't have to take your phone out and wonder about your data and my Wi-Fi's back in the hotel and all this kind. You can just follow me, listen to me. I tell stories the whole way through, and you can listen to me or not. And that's what it's about. So I do the textile tours on a Friday, and then on Saturdays I do flea market tours. That's where we find our vintage printed fabrics, which are gold dust for patchworkers. What did I find the other day? A vintage toile de Jouy from the 1780s that was printed in the Jouy-en-Josas factory by Christoph Oberkampf.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So total treasure. If you're, if that's what if you're like me and that's what you're interested in, treasure. Yeah.
In some of your pictures, like there's so many colors. And I always talk about we're living in such a great time for color.
Mhm.
Do you get into worrying about whether things bleed or whether they're color fast in all those embroidery threads and yarns and things?
Totally. So when I'm in the flea market, you find these really beautiful vintage wooden spools of silk that just look gorgeous. And as an embroiderer, just, someone with a beating heart, all you want to do is buy them and take them home. And
Spool and all.
I have learned the hard way that you buy them, take them home, and put them on a lovely shelf somewhere, because it's actually not that the silk or the cotton doesn't last, well, particularly with silk, because silk is so durable, but it's that the dyes that they used in previous times, they didn't have ecotech in the 18th century. So it's the dyes that are eating the silk, and the silk will just crumble. It just crumble into dust in your hands. And similarly with the cotton. I kind of would be cautious about that with guests on the tour. Like I always say, these are more decorative than useful. I mean, you can use them, but with the awareness that they might kind of crumble away in your hands. And similarly with the fabric, I always get advice from whoever I bought it from. So in the flea market, it's not really that you're going to like a car boot sale. You are like rubbing shoulders with art collectors, textile collectors, museums, galleries. So they're kind of at that level, which means that all of the vendors that I visit anyway are very much experts, and I get very specific instructions on how to wash the pieces of fabric individually and the special products to buy and this, that, and the other. And I often come home and just sit and look at them rather than go to all that hassle. Or frame them. I have a lot of framed fabrics, so that saves all that bicarbonate of soda and all the other kind of potions that I should be using. So yeah.
Now, you first came to me through Joe Andrews of the podcast Haptic and Q. And
Mhm.
I understand, and I actually have purchased, you have travel guides for textiles. And I think you're up to six locations, is it now?
I'm just gonna trust what you said there, yeah, rather than count on the spot. Yeah.
So you've covered Dublin, London, Paris,
Leon,
Lyon, not Versailles, Marseille. Is it Marseille?
Venice.
Venice. I knew that it had a V in it. And New York City,
That's right, the Big Apple.
the
Yeah.
Big Apple. And is this accumulation of knowledge that you've gathered over the years of all the good places to go?
Yeah, well, from my side anyway, what used to happen is that after the textile tour in Paris, my guests would often be heading on to London or Dublin. So they'd ask me for kind of recommendations, and I was sending these emails, and then that email became, a private page on my website and so on. So the idea of this was to kind of share that. And Paris was, kind of easy enough, but I had, whatever it was at that stage, 5 years worth of recommendations for Paris, all of these amazing places that people would miss. I'd see people on the textile tour and it would be their last day in Paris. And I was saying, oh, did you go here? And did you go here? And they say, no. So it's like me when I go traveling, and before I became this kind of textile nerd, even before that, I would arrive and find out, to be honest with you now, the best places to eat first, because you have to have priorities in that, Karen. And then after, on a full stomach, I would head out looking for textiles and fashion and things like that. From what I'm seeing in Paris every week, it's that these stores and craftspeople and artisans and artists just need a little bit of a highlight. Like if we knew they're there, we're definitely going to go, particularly people like us. And we're such a large community who are passionate about this. but we're not always great at marketing. We're not great at speaking about our own work. And in a similar way, these boutiques and craftspeople aren't always great at marketing what they have to offer. So the guides are there to guide us to find these places. And included in them, you have this long, well, depending on the location, a long listing of museums, galleries, fabric boutiques, interior fabric boutiques, libraries, bookshops that specialize in textiles and fashion, haberdasheries or notion stores, and on, whatever that city or destination has to offer. And then you have a link to a Google map with all of the locations pinned. So you can look at the city before you get there and kind of say, okay, well, how far is, the Dior gallery from Auvers-sur-Oise? And can I get there in one day? And can I, map out my route on Google and all of that? You can plan your visits in advance. And then also whilst you're there, you can kind of check back on the guide. They're downloadable PDFs, so they are always on your phone or your iPad. And you can remind yourselves of the places that you want to see in that day if you get a little bit tired.
I downloaded the London one and I found the Google map really helpful.
Yay!
Yeah, I've realized as I've been traveling in the last 4 years,
Mhm.
one, how much if I have a textile connection, it means more for me. But two, it's everywhere. And there's a story behind it. There's either a craftsperson or a family history or even bigger history behind the textiles.
Absolutely. Yeah. I suppose because we're so aware of this, and once you see that, once you're brought into that world, you have this appreciation. That's a mutual exchange then between yourself and the shop owner or the craftsperson. They love seeing people like us come in and fall in love with their work,
Yeah.
and not always buy it, but just appreciate it and kind of, to see that joy in our faces. Like when I finished the textile tours and the flea market tours, the places that I visit, always say, how do you always get such lovely people? I said, I don't know, but they're always lovely. They're just always so excited. So yeah, I think we're a lovely community that recognizes each other, and that's a pleasure. Particularly in France, where people can be sometimes a little bit aloof about their admiration, so it's great to see our, effusive or expressive joy for them.
If people want to get a hold of you or take one of your textile tours or buy one of your textile guides, where do they go?
So my website is Textile Tours of Paris. And there on Textile Tours of Paris, you can book your textile tour, your flea market tour. Sometimes I do online embroidery classes. Sometimes I do more so in the winter, storytelling evenings. And that is also where you can buy your textile travel guides.
Thank you very much for your time. This has just been lovely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen. And it's been fantastic to speak to you as well. Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Rebecca Devaney. Don't you just want to book a flight to Paris right now? If you want to find more about textile tours of Paris or one of the walking guides, I'll have links to both in the video notes below. And until the end of August, you can use the coupon code for 20% off the travel guide to New York City. I'll also have links to her website, her Instagram, and her Facebook page. Next time you're in your sewing room, be sure to have Karen's Quilt Circle playing in the background. I have interviewed so many interesting people on this series. Let one inspire you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.